When two unidentified women's dismembered bodies were found in creeks in Pennsylvania just a month apart, can it be much of a coincidence? And 3 decades later, why don't we have any information on who these women were and what exactly happened to them? Join me as I cover the cases of Poquessing Creek and Valley Creek Does. My name is Brianna, and today I will be going over the case of Poquessing Creek Doe with you. This is the case of a woman who was found on August 15th, 1995 in the Poquessing Creek located in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Remember, as per my last video, this case of Poquessing Creek Doe seems to be kind of intertwined with the last video that I did on Valley Creek Doe, so this kind of acts as a part 2 to that video. With that being said, I really encourage you to refamiliarize yourself with that case, or again, if you haven't watched it already, please go do that. Otherwise, some information in this case, especially at the end, might be a little bit confusing for you. Also, as a reminder, I have started a case submission form, so if there are any cases that you are interested in me covering, please do let me know in that form. It is, again, linked in the description box below. And if you're interested in this type of content, please subscribe to the channel as I put out new videos like these every Wednesday. Now, before I fully delve into this case, I do just want to give a brief trigger or content warning, and I do just want to let you know that I will be briefly discussing the topic of sodomy today in this case. Viewer discretion is, of course, advised. Tuesday, August 15th of 1995 was projected to be a rather hot day with the high sitting at around 96 degrees. Thunderstorms were projected to take place later that day, though that didn't seem to deter two local teenagers named Chris and Jason, 14 and 15 years old at the time, from going fishing in the Poquessing Creek that day. At around 1:30 p.m. that day, the two boys decided to go to a section of the creek located right behind Franklin Mills Mall. And they would be fishing there for about an hour until at around 2:30 p.m. one of the boys would realizing what they were fishing next to. 15-year-old Jason had decided to move from his spot on a log in order to attempt fishing from a tree, though when he looked down, he realized that he saw a human leg. The kids had been sitting next to the decomposing body of a young woman for over an hour while they fished, but they hadn't even realized it, just assuming that it was a dead deer in the creek. Freaked out at the discovery, the two boys would quickly grab their things and run back to the Franklin Mills Mall in order to tell a security guard what they had seen. Though, in reaction, the security guard was kind of skeptical of the two boys, telling them, if you're making this up, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. However, Chris and Jason persisted that they knew what they had seen, and with the help of another security guard, two guards would go to the creek in order to investigate. Upon arrival at the creek, the two men would see exactly what the two boys had seen, and in response, they would immediately call 911. Police would arrive on the scene at approximately 2:30 p.m. and discover a very badly decomposed body. And according to initial reports, the body was headless and was missing one arm. The body was so badly decomposed that no one at the scene was able to tell what race the person was or even what gender they were. And even though the body was missing one arm at the beginning of this discovery, it was determined that police actually had found a nearby arm floating within the creek just upon an initial survey of the scene. So the arms would be found, but unfortunately the head of the person that it belonged to had never been found, and according to reports, both hands also have not been found. In addition, allegedly, according to only one newspaper source from the time, the body also had been sodomized with a 12-inch stake. Now, according to the Latrobe Bulletin, this body was allegedly sodomized, with the author explicitly stating that this information was derived directly from someone in the police department. However, like I mentioned, this is the only newspaper to report this information. And in addition, I feel like there's a few other reasons why we shouldn't fully trust this source of information. My first reason is that this is the only article that's from the Latrobe Bulletin that mentions this case. All other articles that wrote on this case and on the case of Valley Creek Doe are from sources like the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Philadelphia Daily News, which seem like a lot more reliable sources that kind of fact check each other and carry the same basic information as each other. But when you look at the Latrobe Bulletin article, the Latrobe Bulletin just kind of throws random information at you. In addition, the Latrobe Bulletin paper explicitly states that the body found in this creek was male, and as we know now, that is not true. And like I mentioned before, when the body was initially found, it could not be determined what gender they were. But I think that the reason that they had mentioned that the body was male was because a male person's body was actually found in June in that creek, though it was determined that this was a natural death. But it seems like the newspaper kind of just wanted to make this case bigger than it was, or make these two joint alleged male cases bigger than they were, and kind of sensationalize them. In addition, this article also even exaggerates where the other male was found and what happened in his case, stating that the body was found 200 yards away from where the original male was found in June. However, every other report says that that body was actually found over half a mile away. And of course, 200 yards is quite a big difference from half a mile. 200 yards is only about 0.12 miles. So I feel like this kind of proves that the Latrobe Bulletin, or at least the author of the specific article, seems to kind of exaggerate facts. In addition, like I mentioned before, the sodomy has never been mentioned in any other articles, and has not been mentioned in any other internet sources either, so it's not on any databases about this case or anything. So I'm inclined to believe that the information about the body being sodomized was falsified. But now let's get back into the case at hand. So, of course, after the discovery of this body, the police would take back the body to the medical examiner's office in order to examine it. At this point, it was determined by the medical examiner that the person had likely been deceased for between 10 to 14 days at the time of their discovery. After this, the newspaper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, would be the first ones to release any actual information about who this person could have been. On Friday, August 18th, the newspaper released the information about this body, stating that the person found was between 50 and 60 years old and had a crooked spine and small build. Though this was the only description that anyone had to work with until an amended one was put out, also by the Philadelphia Inquirer, on Friday, August 31st, 1995. So over 2 weeks after the body had been initially discovered. On that day, it was released that the body was confirmed to belong to a woman who was between the age of 40 and 50 and was of European descent. She also was described within this paper as having a large frame and a heavy build. However, I'm not exactly sure why there's that big difference in description. Like I mentioned, both of these articles have been released by the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the initial one said a small build. Now this one says a large build, but I'm just not sure. But it seems like at this point, a larger build seems to be more accepted in the case of Poquessing Creek Doe. In addition, the county coroner who had done the examination, Thomas J. Roscoe, would state that the woman, who was likely to be Caucasian, had given birth at least once before in the past and suffered from degenerative arthritis within her spine. She also was described as being approximately 5'4". However, keep in mind that her head was never found, so that could be a few inches off. Roscoe would also go on to say that there was a small hole within the humerus of the upper arm, though we're not sure which arm that was, and would state that this small hole, as well as the arthritis, would have shown up on x-ray results if this person had gotten x-rays before. After this examination, he would also further explain that he believed that the woman actually was in the water for several weeks before her discovery, not just between a week and a half to 2 weeks. In the years since this case occurred, internet sources have slightly changed her description. She is now described as being between 5'4" and 5'5", having weighed between 130 and 170 pounds, and was between the ages of 40 and 53 years old. And no, I'm not sure why they don't just say and 55 years old. There's no information on why they would have chose 53 as the ending number in her age range. And of course, also remember that since her head was never found, we unfortunately do not know any distinctive characteristics of her face. We also do not have information about her hair color or her eye color. Also, if you remember, Roscoe had estimated that she had been dead for several weeks before her discovery. And now, if you look on databases like NamUs or Doe Network, you can find that her post-mortem interval, or the time between her death and when she was found, is estimated to be at approximately 4 weeks. This information will actually be kind of important to a theory that I will be presenting to you later. In addition, because NamUs somehow always has extra information that no one else has in these cases, it's been said that clothing, eyewear, footwear, and some jewelry were found either near or on the body. However, we have no pictures of what that was, even though the NamUs profile with this information on this Poquessing Creek Doe states that you should see photos to see descriptions of these items, but no photos were attached. So I'm not sure how accurate it is that these items were found, but I did just want to make you aware of that. Additionally, I almost forgot to mention, but NamUs also has a picture of a backpack on the Poquessing Creek Doe's profile. That's the only picture that's on there, but they do not state anywhere within that profile how that backpack is related to the case. They don't mention it as being an item found, so I'm not sure why it was there, but I'm assuming it's somehow related to the case. So, like I said, I'm not sure why NamUs has this added clothing information, but I do think that this information was added recently. This is because the Doe Network profile of this victim cites NamUs as a source for the information that was on the Doe Network profile, but they list that there was no clothing found and that the victim was located nude and no jewelry or additional personal items were found with the victim. However, like I said, the NamUs profile now states that there was clothing found with the victim. So given that information, I do believe that the clothing mentioned on NamUs was added recently. The Doe Network profile was last updated in September of 2022, and the NamUs profile was last updated in August of 2024, so I'm assuming that that August date was probably when NamUs added that information, and again, that's why the Doe Network doesn't have that information on their own profile. However, I'm not really sure why, if these clothing items or accessories were found with Poquessing Creek Doe, they wouldn't have been shown or mentioned to newspapers, because you'd think that items like clothing could possibly help someone to identify this doe. But unfortunately, those are answers that we don't really have. So that's kind of where the information on Poquessing Creek Doe's case ends. However, I do just want to say that it seems as though Poquessing Creek Doe's body was cremated, and from what I can tell, no samples of her body were ever kept, like any tissue samples or DNA blood samples were kept. So it seems that even if we might have theories about who this woman was, we might not be able to ever get concrete answers, at least not in the way of DNA testing. I don't know why they would have cremated her, especially why they would have done so without keeping samples, but unfortunately that seems to be what happened according to one recent article. So now that we know as much as we can about Poquessing Creek Doe, let's get into the theories. But before I do that, let me explain to you once more briefly about Valley Creek Doe's case. So Valley Creek Doe's upper body was found within a suitcase lodged into the bank of Valley Creek on July 11th, 1995, just 1 month before Poquessing Creek Doe. The space between these discoveries, and I will have a map on screen now, were only about 48 miles apart, or approximately a 1-hour drive. The legs of Valley Creek Doe were found about 6 months after her initial upper body was discovered, and that was in an area only an hour's drive, or about 50 miles away from where her upper body was. The legs were also found about 10 miles away from, or a 20-minute drive from where Poquessing Creek Doe would have been found. Additionally, Valley Creek Doe was described as being white and or Hispanic, and having short brown hair, about shoulder length, as well as brown eyes. She was between the ages of 17 to 40 years old, weighed between 120 and 140 pounds, and was between 4'11 and 5'4" in height. With the discovery of her upper body, there were several items of clothing that were found within the suitcase that her upper body was in, and with the discovery of her legs, even more clothing was found. Leading up to the discovery of the legs, a jogger would actually follow the trail of clothing, and at the scene of the legs being found, police would find a green garbage bag, and inside were a mix of ladies' and girls' clothing. So now that I've reminded you about Valley Creek Doe's case, let me get into the theories. Now, be mindful that these are just theories, and a lot of them actually come from me. There's really not that many theories surrounding these cases, but in doing the extensive research that I have, I think that there's some interesting theories that I could present to you. So remember, these theories are alleged, so take them with a grain of salt, but I would, of course, be very curious to hear what you think about them. Also, if while going through these cases you thought of any other theories, please feel free to leave them in the comments as well. If you watch my other videos where I discuss some theories, I usually present my theories in least likely to most likely, at least according to me, so that's what I'm going to be doing again in this case. And the first theory that I'm going to be going over today is that the cases are completely unrelated. And I think that this is the number one theory that I need to address before I get into any of my other theories. Basically, it doesn't seem like there's much conversation at this point, or really ever, about people believing that these cases are connected. The only slight indication that I had that at some point there were maybe some theories that these cases were connected were from a paper that was initially reporting the discovery of Poquessing Creek Doe's body, with the title of the article in that paper being called Reeling in Dead Bodies, and the author choosing to make the beginning statement of that article, "Local fishermen are catching a lot more than fish lately. They're turning up dismembered bodies." So I'm not even going to fully get into how insensitive this article is, though literally throughout the whole article they remain to be very insensitive to the fact that someone was found deceased. The article in its entirety will be on screen now, so if you do want to go over it, feel free to pause this video and just give it a read. But one of the craziest quotes that I've ever read came from that article, where the author writes of the boy who found the body of Poquessing Creek Doe, "So why was Chris more freaked out about fishing next to a human body than a dead deer?" I'm not kidding, that was an actual quote. That just seems in poor taste. So the article does mention specifically Valley Creek Doe being found just a month prior, but it doesn't specifically say that the author of the article thinks that they are related at all. I kind of am inclined to believe that the only reason that they actually even mentioned Valley Creek Doe was so the author could write the headline that they did to get more people to read it. However, even though it seems like a lot of people don't fully believe that these cases are connected, I think that it kind of makes a lot of sense for them to be connected, and I'm going to explicitly explain why. I feel like it would be quite a coincidence for two women to be killed, dismembered, and left in creeks in Pennsylvania just a month apart. They also were found in areas that were only an hour's drive away from each other. However, I did think, what if these cases are not directly linked? Which led me to think about the idea that whoever had killed Poquessing Creek Doe may have been a copycat killer. So this kind of takes me to a sub-theory that's within this theory, and that is, again, that this killing was a copycat killing, and that theory goes like this. So basically, the person who had killed Poquessing Creek Doe would have seen the newspapers and the information about Valley Creek Doe's death, and chose to do the same thing to Poquessing Creek Doe, maybe hoping that, like Valley Creek Doe, she would not be identified. And this could make some sense, because if we remember, Poquessing Creek Doe is estimated to have died about 4 weeks before her body was found, and that puts her date of death at around approximately July 18th. That would be just about a week after Valley Creek Doe was discovered. So if Poquessing Creek Doe's killer was different than Valley Creek Doe's killer, that definitely could mean that within the week between news articles coming out and Poquessing Creek Doe's death, the killer had seen that information and basically copycatted what had happened to Valley Creek Doe. So is it possible? Of course, it's entirely possible, but I do think that it's not entirely realistic to believe that two separate people were willing to kill two separate people within that time frame. And also you have to think of the fact that both women were dismembered, which is a whole separate heinous act in comparison to killing somebody. Now we get into theory number 2, which kind of starts the theory that these cases were related, and that is that these women were killed by a serial killer. So for me, I think that there are a few reasons why this theory could be possible, but also, as with any theory, a few reasons why this theory is not entirely possible. A serial killer does make sense given the time discrepancies in their death. So if you recall, like I mentioned, Valley Creek Doe was likely killed about a week before her discovery, possibly around the 4th of July, and Poquessing Creek Doe was killed probably around July 18th, so that's about 2 weeks between the deaths. And this does make sense given the fact that we know that serial killers often have cooling off periods. The serial killer theory also makes sense when you consider the fact of the geographical setting. The area between each of the bodies was only about 50 miles or an hour drive, and oftentimes, as we know, when researching serial killers and doing the work that we have to understand them more, a lot of times serial killers will stick to the same geographical setting that they're comfortable with, oftentimes near their home or near their work. Also, in addition to the geographical setting, if it was in like a comfort zone near this person's work or home, it could make sense why it took especially the legs of Valley Creek Doe so long to be discovered, because this person would have known the spots to dump them in where it was less likely for them to be discovered. However, I kind of think that this is the last good argument for the serial killer theory, and let me explain why. So, in my research that I've done, after the discovery of Poquessing Creek Doe, no other bodies have been discovered in the same state, that being dismemberment, as Valley Creek and Poquessing Creek Does. And if you know anything about serial killers, oftentimes what they do is almost compulsive for them or ritualistic, and depending on their motives, they won't just stop. So it seems kind of unrealistic to think that if there was a serial killer of some sort, they just stopped after killing Poquessing Creek Doe. I also did look into the idea that maybe there was a serial killer who was caught after Poquessing Creek Doe, but it seems like all the serial killers that operated around the Pennsylvania area at the time were all pretty much caught by 1993, which excludes their involvement in cases from 1995. Also, another thing that kind of disproves the serial killer theory is that serial killers often have a victim profile that they follow. So normally, a lot of the times, they look for people who have very specific traits, either have brown hair or are of a certain size, but from what I can tell, it doesn't seem like that's the case with the two does that we have here. Now, Poquessing Creek Doe was between the ages of about 40 to 50 or 40 to 53. And in the case of Valley Creek Doe, a lot of papers and some sources on the internet still now state that it's more believed that she was between the ages of 25 to 30. So if the serial killer did pick these two women, it seems like they didn't really match the same description. However, we don't know if Poquessing Creek Doe actually maybe had short brown hair like Valley Creek Doe, and we don't know that due to the fact that her head was never found, but that could have been maybe the one requirement that the serial killer felt like needed to be filled out. Additionally, the disposal methods for the victims were different. So Valley Creek Doe was dismembered at the waist, with her upper body being put into a suitcase and then disposed of at Valley Creek, and then her legs being disposed of in a local park. However, Poquessing Creek Doe was not dismembered like that. Her head was taken off as well as her hands, kind of indicating that whoever had done that to her wanted to get rid of those parts of her body in order to prevent identification. But in the case of Valley Creek Doe, her head and hands were found. So, like I said, I do think that there's some indication that the serial killer theory could be correct, but there's also some indication that it doesn't quite add up. So now that I have sufficiently talked to you about the serial killer theory, let me get into the last theory, which to me is the most believable. This theory is that the cases were related because the victims were related. This is a theory, again, kind of like all the other ones, that I 100% came up with on my own, but I really do think it holds some ground, and let me explain to you why I think that this is possible. So I believe that it's possible for the victims to be biologically related, and in this case, they could have even been mother and daughter. There are many reasons why I believe this, but the first thing that came to mind when I was initially thinking this is that the age range would match up in some cases. So as we know, Valley Creek Doe was estimated to be between the ages of 17 and 40, with some people and papers that came out around the time believing that it was more likely that she was between the ages of 25 and 30, and Poquessing Creek Doe was believed to be between the ages of 40 and 53 at the time of her death. So that would make sense for a mother and daughter relationship, especially if Valley Creek Doe was on the lower end of her age range. Additionally, if you recall, we know for sure that Poquessing Creek Doe had given birth to at least one child before, according to her autopsy examination. Both does were also described as being white, with the possibility of Valley Creek Doe also being Hispanic. That could also make sense if Valley Creek Doe had a Hispanic father, and that doesn't necessarily exclude Poquessing Creek Doe as her mother. In addition to their physical traits and age ranges, making me believe that they could have been related, like I said, possibly mother and daughter, there's another big reason that I believe that. And that's the fact that Valley Creek Doe was never identified after her reconstruction was released. The reconstruction of Valley Creek Doe was not released until August 4th, which definitely was not at a time when Poquessing Creek Doe was alive. So if Valley Creek Doe was Poquessing Creek Doe's daughter, maybe she either didn't see the initial reports in the papers with the description of her daughter, or didn't think that it bore enough resemblance just written down to be her daughter. This also makes sense as to why no known missing persons reports actually match up to Valley Creek Doe's identification. When you consider the fact that maybe her mother, who could have been Poquessing Creek Doe, was unable to file this report before she unfortunately was killed. Additionally, if you remember from my Valley Creek Doe video, it's kind of debated but seems to be more widely accepted now that Valley Creek Doe was from outside of Pennsylvania, possibly even outside of the States. So if she was an immigrant of some sort, maybe she had no one else that lived in the area that could have reported her as missing. And same with Poquessing Creek Doe if that was her mother. So this is the biggest theory that I have, of course, and I do recognize that the only kind of flaw with that, besides the fact that we don't know fully if they even were biologically related, and we don't have DNA evidence, unfortunately, is the fact that there's that time period between their deaths, because we know that it's likely that Valley Creek Doe died around 4th of July of that year, and Poquessing Creek Doe died around July 18th. That's a full 2 weeks between deaths. However, bear with me, I'm going to go on a tangent, but here's the reason that I think this could work, and this is a possible reconstruction of events that would have taken place to lead to both women's death. So on July 4th, which is anticipated to probably be the day of Valley Creek Doe's death, she attends a party for this holiday. This is a very widely celebrated holiday, and oftentimes this holiday comes along with drinking. It's likely that maybe Valley Creek Doe had celebrated this holiday at this party, maybe with a boyfriend or a partner of some sort. So Valley Creek Doe and possibly her partner decide to have a few drinks at this party. They celebrate the holiday together, but by the end of the night, they're in a fight. And at this time, maybe the fight took place at an isolated area away from the party, or maybe they were back home. Either way, unfortunately, this fight ends with Valley Creek Doe's death, whether intentional by some type of weapon being used, or whether this was an accident, maybe by her having fallen. Either way, the partner panics, and what they do next, unfortunately, would lead to her body eventually being discovered dismembered. So after Valley Creek Doe dies, her partner, or someone else involved basically, takes drastic measures. And what they do is they find a suitcase nearby, again, this could have been at their home, and decides to attempt to put her in the suitcase to get rid of her. That partner probably realizes at this point that her full body probably would not fit in the suitcase, so at this point he dismembers her at the waist. He ends up disposing of both the suitcase and the legs in a different area, maybe trying to throw off identification, and additionally, when he discards of the legs, he also ends up disposing of large amounts of women and girls' clothing, which could have been his partner, Valley Creek Doe's clothing. Now, this really hasn't been mentioned, but given the fact that so many items of clothing were found with Valley Creek Doe's legs, I think that it kind of bears thinking about that maybe that clothing was disposed of because she lived with the person who hurt her and then killed her. Someone who had taken such drastic measures to kill and dismember someone would also probably try to cover that up, and part of that would be maybe taking away her clothing or personal items so that if someone asked about her, they can say, that she moved away or something like that happened. When the partner maybe dumped Valley Creek Doe in those locations, he probably was anticipating that no one would find them, maybe especially with the legs, that wildlife would take them away, or in the case of the suitcase, it would be perceived as garbage and no one would care enough to look at it. But a fisherman a few days later, after the dumping of the body in the suitcase, would find the suitcase, and then subsequently 6 months after that, the legs would be found. Now, after the body was discovered of Valley Creek Doe on July 11th, it's probably anticipated that, it's been about a week since Valley Creek Doe has been heard of. Maybe her mother starts asking questions and wondering where her daughter is. And that mother, of course, could be Poquessing Creek Doe. So Valley Creek Doe's mother, like I said, my theory is that it could be Poquessing Creek Doe, goes to Valley Creek Doe's last known partner and starts asking him questions. And at this point, the partner feels like they are cornered and takes more drastic measures by killing Valley Creek Doe's mother, Poquessing Creek Doe. And after doing that, we know that he already would have been capable of dismembering a body, and he dismembers Poquessing Creek Doe's body as well, taking off her head and her hands, knowing that those are the two main ways of identifying her. We know that both head and hands have never been found, so maybe he disposes of them in some other way, or they were in the creek and never found, but he could have done something like buried these parts of her body so that there would be no proper identification. So this would explain why Valley Creek Doe is left unidentified, since she has no family that's in the area, because again, we kind of believe that maybe she's not from the US, and the family that was in the area is now also deceased, just like she is. Poquessing Creek Doe is also unidentified because nothing distinctive about her has come out, and anything that would have come out about both of these women were really in the local papers at the time. They weren't broadcasted nationally or worldwide or anything like that. So, yes, I'm aware that this theory is probably a little outlandish. However, I don't think that theories like this can be off the table when we're working with such little information, especially about Poquessing Creek Doe. And I don't think that they're off the table, especially when you consider that their bodies were found in a similar state, within only 50 miles from each other or an hour apart, and also both dismembered. However, even if we believe in these theories, unfortunately it doesn't seem like we'll really get an answer on that, considering that Poquessing Creek Doe has allegedly been cremated. There's really no way, I don't think at this point, for DNA to be taken from her to make a positive identification. And even if there is a positive identification of these women being biologically related, we still don't know their identities and we don't know their killer. So that's unfortunately kind of where this case leaves off. However, if you or anyone you know has any information at all about these two unidentified women, please reach out to the proper authorities. The information about the investigating agencies looking into their cases are on screen now, as well as in the description box below, as always. So this concludes the intertwining cases of Valley Creek and Poquessing Creek Doe. Unfortunately, at this point, we only know very limited information about them, and we don't even know their names or what happened to them in life before they were unfortunately killed. But hopefully one day there will be some answers as to their identities. That concludes this case today, but thank you so much for taking the time to listen to both Poquessing Creek Doe's story as well as Valley Creek Doe's story again. Again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished Memories.